The sky was a deep, oppressive crimson, like an open wound bleeding across the heavens. Callum Hayes woke to the sharp sting of smoke in his lungs and the weight of grit pressing into his skin. His head throbbed, his mind sluggish, trapped somewhere between instinct and confusion. When his vision cleared, reality set in. He was no longer in the sterile safety of a transport ship. His survival pod lay in ruins around him, the metal hull split open like a carcass. Shattered control panels flickered weakly, their energy reserves drained. The reinforced polymer canopy, designed to withstand atmospheric re-entry, was fractured, jagged edges bent outward as though something had ripped it open from the inside. The sight sent a chill through his veins. He forced himself to sit up, suppressing a groan as pain bloomed in his side. Blood trickled down his temple, but his wounds were shallow. Lucky, or maybe not. Callum's gaze swept across the alien landscape, a lifeless expanse of jagged rock formations and blackened crags coated in ash. Rivers of molten orange snaked between cracked fissures, illuminating the valley in a hellish glow. Scattered across the plains were the twisted remains of other survival pods. Some were embedded in the cliffside, their occupants nothing more than charred husks. Others had been torn open completely, their contents strewn across the earth like debris after an explosion. Human remains littered the ground, a dismembered arm here, a shredded torso there. The smell of cooked flesh was thick in the air. Callum's heart sank. He had seen carnage before, war zones on distant moons, the aftermath of orbital bombardments. But this was different. This wasn't destruction born from technology. This was hunger. Movement near a nearby pod caught his eye. A survivor, barely more than a boy, crawled out, coughing violently. His jumpsuit was soaked in sweat and soot, his face streaked with tears. Callum rushed over, adrenaline overriding his pain. "Hey, it's okay," Callum said, though the words felt hollow. "You're safe." The boy clutched at Callum's arm with a desperate grip. His eyes were wide, wild. No, we're not. It's out there." Before Callum could ask what he meant, a deep, guttural clicking echoed through the air. A shadow passed over the boy, massive and slow. Callum froze. The boy's terror had form now. The creature was monstrous, a nightmare of blackened chitin, serrated limbs glistening in the dim light. Its mandibles twitched with grotesque precision, releasing a wet hiss that reverberated through the ground. Its carapace pulsed as though something alive and restless writhed beneath the surface. Callum's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was doing. It was smelling them. "Run," Callum whispered. The boy bolted, stumbling toward the nearest rise of rocks. The creature turned, faster than something that size had any right to be. It lunged, serrated legs unfolding with a crackling snap. Callum barely had time to shout before the boy was skewered through the chest. The boy's scream cut off as the creature hoisted him into the air, his body twitching as the mandibles locked around his skull. With a sickening crunch, the boy's head collapsed inward, his limbs going limp. Callum backed away, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't save him. He couldn't. The creature dropped the boy's lifeless body and began tearing through his torso, feeding with grotesque abandon. Callum forced himself to move. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Running meant making noise. Instead, he crouched low and slipped behind a half-buried escape pod, keeping his breathing shallow. The creature fed noisily, cracking bone and slurping marrow. Callum's stomach churned. When the beast finally stilled, it began to change. Callum's eyes widened in horror as its exoskeleton split, sloughing off like wet paper. Beneath the cracked shell, sinew and muscle shifted, rearranging. The creature was absorbing the boy's flesh, reshaping itself. Its chitin grew thicker, human vertebrae stitched grotesquely into its back, forming a ridge of bone. The boy's fingers twitched from its abdomen like discarded remnants, half consumed. Callum swallowed his terror and kept moving inch by inch. He couldn't afford to look back. If he hesitated even for a second, he'd end up like the boy, stripped down to bones and horror. He made it to the ridge's edge, the molten river casting waves of heat against his face. A narrow ledge ran along the cliffside. He climbed onto it, careful not to dislodge any loose stones. Below, the lava churned in angry swirls. One misstep, and he'd be incinerated. Another wet click echoed behind him. The creature had finished its meal. Callum's muscles screamed in protest as he clung to the rock face, sweat soaking through his clothes. The ledge narrowed ahead. He had to jump. But his relief was short-lived. In the distance, more shadows were moving. The creatures were converging, drawn by the scent of blood and fear. The sound of their clicking grew louder, overlapping in an unholy symphony. Callum's smile faded. He wasn't out of this yet. He pressed onward, scaling the rocky ridge until he reached a jagged outcrop overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, he saw the full scope of their nightmare. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of the creatures roamed the desolate plains, feeding on the remains of fallen humans and each other. The ground was littered with discarded bones and half-digested limbs. Callum's breath shuddered. The Zeleth had exiled humanity here to die. But the aliens had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. Callum stared into the abyss below, fists clenched. If this was how the story ended, then he would fight until the bitter end. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't the end of humanity. It was the beginning of something else. He turned his gaze toward the jagged horizon, his mind already racing with plans. If they wanted to survive, they couldn't just endure. They had to become something more dangerous than the monsters hunting them. The cave was dark, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and ash. Callum crouched near the entrance, staring out at the endless expanse of Cairn 4's scarred landscape. His muscles were taut, every sound sharpening his senses. The planet wasn't silent. It pulsed with alien life, the distant calls of predators, the crackle of fissures opening and closing in the shifting crust, and always the distant clicking of the crawl. Behind him, deeper in the cavern, the survivors stirred. There were 15 of them now. Just days ago, it had been half that number. Callum knew better than to call it a victory. Every face in the cave was gaunt, haunted by memories of what they had witnessed. The boy from the crash site still haunted his mind, but Callum had no room for grief. Survival didn't allow it. "Everyone awake," he said, his voice low but firm. "Time to move." There were groans as people forced themselves out of restless sleep. Ava Sharp was the first to rise, already fastening the harness of her crude satchel. The dark-haired biologist had been an asset from the moment he'd found her. She didn't waste time with panic, only solutions. "How's the perimeter?" Ava asked, brushing dust from her sleeves. "Quiet for now," Callum replied. "But they're out there. They're always out there." Ava nodded grimly. "Then let's get this done before they decide we're food." The plan was simple, at least on paper. They needed food, supplies, and anything they could scavenge to reinforce the cave. The volcanic ridge was a natural defensive position, but it wasn't indestructible. If the Krall found them en masse, they'd be buried alive. As the group prepared to head out, one of the younger survivors, Samir, barely in his 20s, hesitated near the edge of the firelight. "We don't have to do this," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "We could stay here, just hide." Callum approached slowly, placing a hand on Samir's shoulder. His grip was firm but not harsh. "You think we can hide from them?" Callum asked, voice low but steady. "Those things. They don't stop. They don't sleep. You saw what they did to the others. You saw what they are. They'll tear this place apart eventually." Samir's eyes flickered with the memory of something unspeakable. "You want to live?" Callum continued. "We have to fight for it." Every damn second, Samir swallowed hard and gave a reluctant nod. Callum squeezed his shoulder once before stepping back. "Let's go." The group descended the ridge, careful to stick to the narrow paths that wove through the volcanic rock. The heat from the fissures shimmered in the air, making the horizon swim. Callum took point, his makeshift spear, fashioned from scavenged steel and sharpened bone, held at the ready. As they moved through a ravine, Ava fell into step beside him. "We're pushing them hard," she said quietly. "You know that, right?" "I know," Callum replied without looking at her. "They're scared," Ava pressed. "That fear can break people if we're not careful." Callum exhaled through his nose. "Fear keeps them alive." Ava didn't argue, but Callum could feel the weight of her silence. He understood her concerns. Hell, he shared them. But there was no room for softness on Cairn 4. Survival demanded hardness. They reached the edge of a vast plateau where skeletal alien trees jutted from the ground like dead fingers. Their blackened bark crackled as the wind pushed through their brittle branches. Among the debris were wreckages of more survival pods, some intact, others shattered. "Fan out," Callum ordered. "Stay in pairs." The survivors spread out, scavenging through the wreckage. They pried open broken crates, pulling out emergency rations, fragments of metal, and canisters of filtration gel. Samir found a medkit and held it up with a flicker of hope. Callum gave a nod of approval. Ava knelt near a pile of twisted steel and unearthed a jagged cylinder, an oxygen tank intact. She flashed Callum a grin, but her expression quickly soured. A sound rippled through the air, low, guttural, and wet. Callum's blood went cold. "Back to the ridge," he shouted, his voice cutting through the scavenging noises. "Now!" The group sprang into motion, but it was too late. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their elongated limbs scraping against the rocks. There were 3 of them, hulking, with plates of segmented armor shimmering in the low light. Their eyes, if they had any, were hidden behind layers of fused bone and sinew. Their mandibles twitched with anticipation. Callum's heart pounded as he shoved Ava behind him. "Go!" The first Kral lunged, its legs slicing through the air like scythes. Callum threw his spear with all his strength. The weapon struck home, driving into the creature's exposed underbelly. The Kral screeched and staggered, black ichor spilling from the wound, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. The other creatures charged. Samir screamed as one of them closed in, claws slashing toward him. Ava moved faster than Callum had ever seen. She swung a jagged steel pipe with desperate force, catching the Kral in the jaw. The impact shattered part of its mandible, but it retaliated with a brutal swipe that sent her sprawling. Callum ripped his spear from the first Kral's corpse and ran toward Ava, driving the weapon downward into the creature before it could finish her. He twisted the spear until its carapace cracked apart, the creature's body twitching in death throes. The rest of the group fought with everything they had: clubs, knives, anything sharp enough to pierce. By the time the final Kral fell, panting and bloodied humans stood over the corpses, their bodies coated in ash and ichor. Callum's chest heaved as he surveyed the aftermath. Samir was trembling, eyes locked on the dismembered pieces of the dead Kral. Ava was on her feet again, blood trickling from a gash in her forehead. "We have to move," Callum said, though his voice felt like gravel in his throat. "More will come." The group didn't argue. They grabbed whatever they could carry and made their way back to the ridge, battered but alive. As they reached the safety of the cave, Callum turned to face the group. "You fought like hell out there," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion dragging at his bones. "We're not prey, not anymore. We're still here, and we're going to keep fighting." The survivors stared back at him, something sparking in their eyes. Ava wiped the blood from her face and muttered, "We don't die that easily." Callum's mouth twitched into a faint, grim smile. He knew this wasn't the end of their trials. The Kral would return, stronger and smarter. But as long as they drew breath, humanity wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The firelight flickered against the jagged walls of the cavern, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Callum sat near the far wall, sharpening a crude blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Every scrape of metal against stone echoed through the silence. He didn't need to speak. The unspoken tension had settled over the survivors like a shroud. They were changing. He glanced at Ava, who stood near the entrance, watching the darkness beyond the ridge. The cut on her forehead had sealed into a jagged scar, but it wasn't the wound that unnerved him. It was her expression. Cold, focused. She hadn't flinched when they'd burned the Kral corpses after the last attack, even as the acrid smoke choked the air. The same look was spreading among the group. Fear was slowly giving way to something else. Determination. Callum rose to his feet. "It's time," he said. The survivors gathered around him, some still wrapping crude bandages over their wounds. Samir's hands were blistered, his knuckles raw from the last fight. He looked more hollow than ever, but his eyes burned with something Callum recognized. Resolve. "We can't wait for the next attack," Callum began, voice steady. "We've seen how they learn. The Kral adapt fast, but so do we. He looked around at the group. If we're going to survive, we need to stop running. We need to fight like they fight, by using everything this planet throws at us. A murmur rippled through the group. Ava stepped forward, arms crossed. You're talking about more than defense, aren't you? Callum nodded. We're not just going to hold our ground. We're going to become the predators. There was a brief silence before Ava spoke again. How? Callum crouched near the fire, pulling out a cloth bundle. He unwrapped it, revealing a severed piece of Kral carapace. Its glossy black surface was hard as steel, but light enough to lift with one hand. The Kral are built to hunt and survive, Callum said, turning the fragment in his hands. We can use that. Ava knelt beside him, her sharp eyes flicking over the carapace. You're suggesting we wear it? Callum met her gaze. Why not? Their armor's stronger than anything we've got. If we can refine it, we can reinforce our weapons, even protect ourselves. He paused. It's dangerous, but everything about this planet is. Ava exhaled slowly. Then we start with small tests. Within hours, the cavern became a workshop of desperate ingenuity. The survivors dismantled Kral corpses, cutting through sinew and bone with improvised tools. The air filled with the acrid stench of alien innards. Ava worked alongside Samir and the others, experimenting with ways to bind the carapace to scraps of human clothing and salvaged gear. At first, the attempts were crude. Makeshift shields that shattered under pressure, armor plates that restricted movement. But after dozens of failures, they began to see progress. The carapace could be softened and molded by heating it near the volcanic vents before cooling it rapidly. With practice, they forged lightweight breastplates, gauntlets reinforced with serrated bone, and helmets with reinforced visors made from survival pod glass. The next challenge was their weapons. Callum studied a serrated krail claw, running his fingers along the jagged edge. It was sharper than anything they could forge on their own, but brittle. He experimented by binding the claws to lengths of steel and sealing them with resin extracted from alien plants. The result was brutal. Blades that could slice through Kral armor, but also through human flesh just as easily. Ava watched him work, her brow furrowed. You realize what we're becoming, she said quietly. Callum didn't look up. We're doing what we have to. Are we? Ava's voice softened. Or are we becoming something else entirely? Callum paused, the blade glinting in the firelight. If it keeps us alive, does it matter? The conversation ended there, but the question lingered. Days passed, and the survivors trained with their new weapons, their movements growing sharper, more efficient. Callum led them through drills, ambush tactics, close-quarters combat, precision strikes. The Kral weren't mindless. They were hunters. But now, so were the humans. The first real test came at dawn. The scouts spotted a Kral hunting pack moving toward the ridge. 6 of them, larger than the usual swarm, their bodies reinforced with new plates of bone. They had learned from their losses. But this time, the humans didn't wait. Callum led the attack, leaping down from the ridge with his reinforced spear in hand. The first Kral screeched as he drove the weapon through its thorax, twisting until he heard the carapace crack. Behind him, Ava's group flanked the remaining creatures, slashing through their legs to cripple their movements. Samir swung his serrated axe with a shout, cleaving through the neck of a kraal that tried to retreat. The creature spasmed, ichor spraying in thick black arcs. One of the larger kraal surged forward, its mandibles snapping with bone-shattering force. Ava dodged to the side and plunged a dagger into the beast's side, twisting until it howled. Callum moved in behind it, driving his spear into the base of its skull. The creature convulsed once before collapsing. When the last kraal fell, the survivors stood among the carnage, blood and ichor dripping from their weapons. The smell of death was suffocating, but no one flinched. No one looked away. Callum surveyed the battlefield, his breath ragged. "We just killed a hunting pack." Ava wiped ichor from her blade, her face unreadable. "We didn't just kill them," she muttered. "We wiped them out." The survivors gathered the remains, dragging them back to the ridge. They stripped the corpses, adding new armor to their growing cache of weapons and defenses. But the changes went beyond their gear. The survivors moved with a new purpose, their eyes hard, their bodies lean and scarred. Their movements were precise, like predators stalking prey. They didn't speak much anymore. There was no need. They understood what they had become. Callum stood at the mouth of the cave, staring out over the expanse of Cairn 4. The horizon shimmered with heat, distant crags pulsing like veins. Somewhere beyond those cliffs, the Broodheart pulsed in the depths of the planet, spawning more kraal. "We're not just surviving anymore," Ava said quietly, stepping beside him. Callum nodded. "Number, we're winning." But in the pit of his stomach, he felt something darker stir. Victory had a cost, and he wasn't sure how much humanity they had left to give. The earth trembled beneath their feet as Callum led the survivors down into the abyss. The molten rivers that had once glowed in the distance now pulsed like veins threading through the planet itself. The deeper they descended, the thicker the air became, hot, metallic, and cloying. Sweat soaked through their armor, their breaths ragged from the rising heat. The cavern walls bled with phosphorescent ooze that cast an eerie green light across the jagged stone. Callum's hands clenched around the shaft of his spear as the path narrowed into a twisting tunnel. His heart pounded in his chest, but not from fear. This was it, the heart of the kraal, the Broodheart. If they could destroy it, they could cut the swarm off at the source. He had no illusions that this was a suicide mission. They all knew it, but none of them had turned back. "Keep moving," Callum said, his voice barely more than a growl. Behind him, Ava followed, her face pale beneath streaks of ash and dried ichor. Samir and the others trudged behind, their makeshift weapons glinting in the dim light. Their armor, patched together from shards of kraal exoskeleton, clanked with each step, a grim reminder of how far they'd come. They didn't look like the humans who had crashed here anymore. They looked like something born of the planet's fury. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The sight stole the air from their lungs. The Broodheart was alive, a pulsating mass of muscle and sinew sprawled across the cavern, fused into the stone. Its surface writhed with veins as thick as tree trunks, pumping viscous fluid through its grotesque form. eyes, too many to count, blinked and swiveled across its surface, scanning in all directions. Its flesh pulsed in a rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat too massive to belong to any one creature. And beneath it, embedded like grotesque larvae, were thousands of Kral eggs. Some had already begun to hatch, fleshy limbs twitching as the newborn predators clawed their way free. For a long moment, the group stood in horrified silence. The Broodheart's mass heaved with each breath, releasing clouds of spore-laden mist that drifted through the chamber. Callum felt the sting in his throat as the spores settled in his lungs. The air itself felt alive, hostile. "We've found it," Ava whispered, her voice hollow. "God help us." "No gods here," Callum muttered. He tightened his grip on his spear. "Only us." The Broodheart must have sensed them. A deafening roar echoed through the chamber as it stirred. The eggs began to split open faster, spilling out new Krail, each one bigger and more grotesque than the last. "Form up," Callum shouted. "Hold the line." The survivors surged into position, forming a defensive semicircle. The first wave of Kral lunged forward, twisting monstrosities of bone and sinew, their bodies still wet from birth. Samir let out a guttural yell as he swung his axe, cleaving through one creature's legs. Another Kral leapt toward Ava, its mandibles spread wide. She dodged and drove her blade upward, slicing through its thorax in a spray of ichor. The chamber erupted into chaos. The Kral swarmed like a tide of teeth and claws, but the humans didn't falter. They fought with savage precision, their armor deflecting blows that would have shattered bone. Callum drove his spear into the chest of a hulking Kral, twisting until its body convulsed and collapsed. He ripped the weapon free and turned just in time to impale another. But the Broodheart's roar intensified, shaking the cavern. Tendrils erupted from the walls, writhing like massive serpents. One lashed out, catching a survivor and slamming them into the stone with a sickening crack. Another wrapped around Samir's waist, lifting him into the air. He screamed as it began to tighten, the sound of his ribs snapping echoing through the chamber. "Samir!" Ava cried, sprinting forward. She leapt onto the tendril, plunging her dagger into its thick hide. Black fluid sprayed across her face as she carved through the muscle, severing the tendril. Samir fell to the ground, gasping for air, but alive. Callum's voice rang out above the din. "Now! Plant the charges!" Ava and two others pulled the explosive canisters from their satchels, improvised bombs filled with volatile compounds scavenged from the planet's natural toxins. They sprinted toward the base of the Broodheart, dodging tendrils and snapping jaws. Callum covered them, his spear a blur of movement as he fought off the advancing Kral. Ava reached the base of the massive heart and slammed the first charge into place. She looked up and locked eyes with Callum across the chaos. 10 seconds, she shouted. Callum nodded, his chest tightening. "Fall back." The survivors began their retreat, cutting their way through the swarm as the charges beeped in unison, their lights flashing red. The Broodheart writhed, sensing its impending destruction. Its roar became a deafening wail, a sound that shook the very bones of the cavern. Callum grabbed Ava's arm as she stumbled, dragging her toward the tunnel. The others followed, bloodied and battered. The chamber behind them erupted as the charges detonated. The explosion was blinding, a wave of heat and force that ripped through the cavern. The Broodheart's massive form ruptured, its flesh splitting apart in a spray of molten ichor. The eggs burst, their unhatched horrors consumed in the inferno. The cavern walls cracked and buckled as fire and debris filled the space. Callum and the others reached the tunnel just as the ceiling collapsed behind them, sealing the chamber in a tomb of stone and flame. They stumbled into the open air, coughing and gasping as ash rained down from the sky. The ground beneath them shook with aftershocks. For a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. They stood on the ridge, staring at the horizon as the smoke billowed into the blood-red sky. The Broodheart was gone. The Kraul were leaderless now, mindless predators with no hive to guide them. The swarm would die off, scattered and broken. Callum dropped to one knee, his exhaustion catching up to him. Ava knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. Callum stared out at the wasteland before them. "Not yet," he said quietly, "but soon." The survivors gathered in silence, their faces hollow with grief and victory. They had won, but the cost was etched into their scars, their bones. They had lost too many. Callum rose to his feet, his body aching but unbroken. He turned to face the others. "We came here as prey," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "We leave as something else." The survivors stared back at him, their expressions hard, unyielding. They had become more than human, hardened by fire and death, reforged in the crucible of this hostile world. Callum looked toward the sky, where distant stars blinked in the void. He thought of the Zealoth, the architects of their exile. They had tried to destroy humanity by casting them into hell. But they had forgotten one thing. Humanity had always thrived in hell. The final words he spoke were not a promise. They were a warning. "They'll never see us coming." The survivors turned away from the horizon, their path lit by the dying glow of the Broodheart's ashes. And as they walked, their shadows stretched long against the scorched earth, a new breed of predator born from death